Half the 90s went by, and we're now at the point where it can be said that we have nearly crossed into what we could have called the modern age of gaming not that long ago. I think there's one more step needed before we get there, but for the most part, the video games industry is falling into place and is nearly what we know it to be today. Nearly. Until then, we're at least stepping into the 3D age fully, with Nintendo being the last major holdout that had yet to fully embrace this form of gaming. That'll change in 1996 with the release of the Nintendo 64, still a cartridge-based system, meaning that it had really low capacity compared to the CD, about 10 times less, but it also meant that it had very low loading times compared to a CD. And contrary to what a lot of platforms did in the past couple of years, platforms that tended to go poof quite soon, the N64 launched with its killer app, the first of quite a few. A game that, although some say was kind of based on ideas borrowed in heavy quotation marks from the developers of Star Fox, the Argonauts, is still a perfect game to showcase this new age. That game was Super Mario 64, a transition of a genre from 2D to 3D with a level of success and craftsmanship that is rarely seen. The platformer worked in 3D, and Nintendo proved it. The genre would never be the same again, and in some cases with somewhat disastrous consequences, though again, disastrous is a relative term. We're still talking about video games. Whereas 1996 brought us other things to be afraid of. It was when the great mad cow disease scare really took off. It was a year when many people died in bombings all over the world. A bunch of churches were burned in the USA, and the tragedy in Australia led to strict gun regulations that, in hindsight, seemed to be kind of an okay idea. Cloning also seemed like an okay idea back then, with Dolly the sheep being the first mammal clone from an adult somatic cell using the process of nuclear transfer. The internet was booming, the number of host computers going from 1 million to 10 million that year. The 3DFX Voodoo, one of the first commercial 3D graphics accelerators, was released that year, being a successful enough product for the time. And Cyrex CPUs started going out of favor and quickly dwindled into obscurity. Both of these final two events happened because of the same thing: Quake. From the creators of Doom, Quake represented a total departure from the pretense of 3D graphics. This wasn't pretend anymore. This was full three-dimensional everything. Levels, enemies, items, even bullets were modeled in 3D, occupying a space in the world and having a physics component tied to them. Quake lit the world on fire and showed us exactly what could be accomplished when technological limitations that were present through all of these decades up until now just faded away. Even though it was still a shooter, just like Doom was, and was 3D, just like System Shock was and Descent was, the way it played was like none of them. Movement became the key focus. Fluid, fast, precise, fun movement. Understanding how objects interacted inside the game became the key to success. Understanding and knowing how to do a rocket jump, a grenade jump, how to calculate where your bullets, where your projectiles will land on a moving enemy. That became a new paradigm. The multiplayer first-person shooter was never going to be the same again. Quake was a milestone in technology and design that can be said truly started in modern age. It brought us the beginning of esports as we know them now, not in the arcades like they used to be in the old days you've seen in the movie The Wizard. And it had a robust enough infrastructure to allow for the development of massively different total conversion mods, which were distributed across the internet and allowed people to work on them simultaneously from all over the world. It brought us machinima, or machinima as some call it, the act of turning in-game actions into a movie. And it brought us QuakeCon, one of the oldest and largest LAN and gaming community events in the world. Speaking of gaming events, there was one other thing that I forgot to mention last year, with my apologies. So in 1996 we got the second edition of the E3 Gaming Conference, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, an industry event dedicated to professionals touting their best games. It was and still is the most famous of these events, though in terms of sheer size it is dwarfed by a few others that are a bit more open to the public. And speaking of things that dwarfed other things, Bethesda followed up the Elder Scrolls Arena with the sequel to seemingly end all sequels, a bug-ridden but completely over-the-top game called Daggerfall. One that had so many places to visit, so many towns, dungeons, characters, procedurally generated content, quests, items, character customization options, and sheer gameplay choices that it is still considered to this day one of the greatest achievements in gaming history. Yes, it could get repetitive, but it went above and beyond with the amount of leeway it gave you to decide exactly what to do and how to do it. If it got boring, it's because you were boring. And as I've said before, we are at the point where the industry we know is starting to take shape, and that showed very well with Wing Commander 4. A game with an even bigger budget than the previous one, and that one had a record-setting budget, the biggest one ever seen for a video game. And yet, even with this, Wing Commander 4 was still rushed out the door before they could actually complete the game, setting a dangerous precedent for the industry. For example, Wing Commander 4 didn't have cockpits for ships anymore, and people in the industry saw that as the new trend, an attempt to look more like first-person shooters, to do away with cockpits. I mean, who cares about them? And everybody started dropping cockpits. But the truth was that they were going to have cockpits, only they were scrapped because there wasn't any time to put them into the game. But since this was the big dog, the big seller, the game starring Luke Skywalker, it was the one that many tried to follow. And that's why we have so many games today that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and still feel kind of incomplete when they're released. And then we get a bunch of cheaper games that are still kind of meh, because they try to look exactly like those other games. We'll get to the piss filter debacle of the mid-2000s a bit later. The survival horror genre hit the mainstream in '96 with the release of Capcom's Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's known in Japan. A game that really made the PlayStation stand out, even though it was ported to both the Windows PC platform and the Sega Saturn. It featured a style that would be prevalent for quite some time in this space. And sure, it did borrow quite a lot from Alone in the Dark, from its control scheme to its basic idea, but it did continue to push the idea of using 3D real-time rendered characters placed on top of a 2D pre-rendered background. The game is notable for being quite fun to play, challenging, at times even scary, and for also having an atrocious English version with very poor but charming acting. Yet the game that really made the PlayStation stand out that year, again, even though this game was on plenty of other platforms, was Core Design's Tomb Raider. This was an evolution of an idea of the platformer, the cinematic platformer, the action game, and the idea of putting puzzles with giant blocks of stone everywhere, all combined into one. Tomb Raider quickly became a major seller and a property that broke through into the mainstream like few others did before, thanks to the charisma and marketability of its main character, Lara Croft. Sequels were abound this year, just like, well, they were kind of starting to be abound every year. Civilization stepped into a new age, that of Windows, with a second outing that proved it was more than just a flash in the night. It brought expanded gameplay, expanded factions, and advisors that were a bit more fleshed out, now played by flesh and blood actors, one of them being Elvis, an Elvis impersonator that evolved as time went on, in the sense of he changed his clothes until he was Elvis, but he always acted like him. It's a feature that was it was a feature they would drop in later games, but it was quite a distinct one. Master of Orion also got a sequel, The Battle at Antares, thus Microprose making sure it had both land and space for its games locked down, at least for a while while because the main developers of Civilization sort of quit after Civilization 2 and formed a new studio, Firaxis. Command & Conquer continued with Red Alert, a more grounded approach to warfare, or as grounded as time travel can be. Still, it was a bit more sensical than its sequels. Duke Nukem moved into 3D as well, becoming a first-person shooter with a style that aimed to ape Hollywood movies, action ones usually, and some other ones, bringing bucket loads of fun to anybody that wanted really good level design, fancy weapons, and something that kids probably should not have been playing, but you know they did. Parents have always been really bad at their job. The Settlers 2 was released by Blue Byte that year, becoming the most beloved title in the series. And Heroes of Might and Magic 2 as well became an instant hit, making sure that Might and Magic would be a name that would live on, even though the main series at that point seemed to have ended. And also making a lot of people happy over the next few decades, especially me. But it wasn't all sequels. Not yet at least. Harvest Moon made children and grown-ups all over the world dream of one day owning their own farm. Blood Omen brought Shakespearean vampiric tales to the forefront of gaming. Pokemon Red Blue started a much beloved series of video games based on kidnapping small animals and using them to fight other kidnapped small animals. Now sure, as time went on, it became a bit of a cult, not in the sense of a cult hit, but a cult, but it was an absolutely fantastic game when it came out, a portable game, one that you could play everywhere without running into traffic to catch a Pokemon. This was also the year when Revolution Software gave to the world one of the most beautiful adventure games ever conceived, a cinematic masterpiece of style and substance in the form of the classic Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars, among the more grounded adventure games of its time, featuring very little in the way of Moonman logic, though it did have that puzzle with the goat. That was a game about terrorism, about seeking justice, and about wondering, was I supposed to do anything with the other half of that towel? Lastly, this is the year when Valve was formed, when Black Isle was created, when a small company called The Condor changed its name to Blizzard North and brought us Diablo, the game that took the RPG out of the age of turn-based games and straight into the hearts and arms of everyone. Sure, it was far from being the first real-time RPG, but it was a very solid implementation of the idea. So solid, it became the foundation for basically a new kind of genre, the hack-and-slash RPG genre, with a familiar and very enjoyable formula. The same formula that we had seen in the oldest mainframe RPGs. Procedurally generated dungeons, random items, monsters to slay, a town to come back to where you could talk to some NPCs and sell your stuff. A single one, not the many ones that Daggerfall had. And it also had one very important characteristic that all those ancient mainframe games didn't have. I mean, apart from functional multiplayer through the infant BattleNet. It had atmosphere, it had mood, it had a soundtrack that made your spine tingle, and enough tactical depth to it to keep you glued to the game for years, or at least until it got bored, left it for a while and came back a couple of years later. Even though it did have a PlayStation version, much like many attempts at porting great PC games to consoles, Command & Conquer being another example, it's on the PC that it stayed and blossomed, at least until the third one. So what can I call the game of 1996? It would have to be Quake. Much like its predecessor, Quake was not only a genre-defining title, but it defined a generation. It defined this bit of the decade, a culture, a style, and in time, it defined the entire industry. Yes, I know that Super Mario 64 was also a very important game, and so was Tomb Raider and Diablo and Daggerfall, and I also forgot to mention that in '95 we got the Mortal Kombat movie, which was at the time the best adaptation of a video game ever seen, but that's not important. The important thing is that we have to remember that without Quake, the first-person shooter genre would be unrecognizable today. So many things hinge on its existence, require it to exist, began as mods for it, that today first-person shooters would just be, well, I don't know what they would be without the people that tried to mod Quake. And also, let's not forget one final thing for the year 1996. This was when a human chess champion was defeated for the first time by a machine. Garry Kasparov was beaten by IBM's Deep Blue, setting the stage for something that would many years later become a very important question. Will machines make us obsolete? But I doubt I'll have the answer in this series, though there is still a lot left of the year 2018, so who knows. Come back next week for 1997. Goodbye.